Static chewed through the studio monitors before the screaming began. Not audible sound, but a jagged spike driven straight into the cerebral cortex. 7 billion people dropped to their knees, choking on phantom ash. They thought they broke us. They forgot we already weaponized noise decades ago. Coffee spilled over the rim of a chipped ceramic mug, pooling across the scarred laminate of the mixing console. Ackley did not notice. His fingers remained locked on the equalizer sliders, knuckles white, while a high-pitched whine bored a microscopic hole through the center of his skull. It smelled like ozone and pennies. It tasted like an old 9-volt battery pressed flat against the tongue. This wasn't sound. Ackley, who had spent 30 years of his life agonizing over the minutiae of hertz and decibels in windowless basements, knew what sound felt like. Sound pushed air. Sound vibrated the tiny hairs in the inner ear. This sensation was different. It bypassed the tympanic membrane entirely, manifesting directly inside the soft grey matter of his brain like a tumour blooming in real time. A sharp, violent wave of nausea folded him in half. Ackley retched dryly, hitting his knees on the stained carpet of the recording booth. Dust motes danced in the pale glow of the LED screens above him, indifferent to his sudden inability to breathe. He grabbed the leg of his swivel chair, gasping, trying to anchor himself to a reality that was rapidly dissolving into absolute, unadulterated terror. It felt like being buried alive. The heavy, suffocating pressure of dirt pressing down on the chest. The certainty that no one was coming. It was every primal childhood nightmare. The monster under the bed, the endless drop in the dark, the cold breath on the back of the neck, distilled into a continuous, unrelenting broadcast. Across the room, a heavy thud shook the floorboards. Chase had fallen off the battered faux leather couch. The bassist lay tangled in a mess of coiled XLR cables and empty takeout containers, his lanky limbs thrashing. Chase wasn't screaming with his mouth, but his eyes were wide, the whites entirely visible, staring at a ceiling he clearly didn't see. He was scratching furiously at his own temples, drawing thin, jagged red lines down his pale skin. "Chase!" Ackley choked out. The word felt like sandpaper scraping his throat. He forced himself upward, muscles trembling uncontrollably. Every instinct screamed at him to curl into a fetal position and wait for death. The sheer weight of the psychic dread was a physical load on his shoulders. He stumbled, his heavy boots catching on a microphone stand, sending a vintage condenser mic crashing to the floor. The loud physical noise barely registered over the roaring silence in his head. Ackley reached Chase, grabbing the younger man's wrists. Chase's skin was ice-cold and slick with a sudden greasy sweat. "Stop it, kid," Ackley wheezed, pinning Chase's arms to the floor. "Hey, look at me. It's a frequency. It's just a frequency." It was a lie, or at least a guess. But Ackley needed something technical to cling to. If he didn't analyze it, he would drown in it. He forced his brain to break down the terror. High amplitude, sine wave characteristics. It peaks around 14,000 Hz in the phantom audio spectrum, but it carries a subharmonic undercurrent. The studio's heavy reinforced door suddenly slammed open. Diana stood in the doorway, framed by the flickering emergency lights of the subterranean corridor outside. She didn't look like a high-ranking military communications liaison. Her usually immaculate uniform was torn at the collar, and her face was an ashen mask of raw panic. She clutched a heavy steel wrench in her right hand, knuckles completely bloodless, as if ready to fend off ghosts. "It's everywhere," Diana gasped, her voice trembling, lacking all of its usual sharp authority. She leaned heavily against the doorframe, chest heaving. "Upstairs, the entire base. They're clawing their own eyes out, Artie. They're jumping off the comms towers." Ackley slowly let go of Chase, who had curled into a tight ball, sobbing quietly into the carpet. What is it?" Ackley asked, dragging himself over to the mixing desk. He pulled a rag from his pocket and mechanically wiped the spilled coffee off the console, an absurd gesture of domesticity in the face of an apocalypse. "Did someone drop a bomb?" "Orbit," Diana said. She practically fell into the room, kicking the heavy door shut behind her. The heavy thud of the acoustic seals engaging offered no relief from the pressure in their heads. NORAD tracked 12 signatures entering low Earth orbit 20 minutes ago. Massive craft. We tried to hail them. Then this started. It's a broadcast, Ackley muttered. He pressed the palms of his hands hard against his eyes, trying to massage away the phantom spikes of light flashing behind his eyelids. It's a psychic attack, Diana corrected, leaning against the rack mounts. She looked utterly defeated, a woman watching the world end and finding herself unable to fight back. The eggheads in DARPA warned us about theoretical neurolinguistic hacking, bypassing auditory reception to stimulate the amygdala directly. Total systemic fear induction. We can't fight them if our soldiers can't even stand up. Ackley looked at his audio console. The meters were completely dead. The room was perfectly quiet. Yet the roaring dread persisted. It was a flawless, sterile transmission of pure despair. And Ackley hated it. He didn't hate it just because it was terrifying. He hated it because it was artificial. It was a sterile, perfectly synthesized wave of mathematical dread. It lacked humanity. It lacked texture. Nothing is absolute, Diana, Ackley grunted. He reached out with a trembling hand and powered up the main monitors. If it's a wave, it has a frequency. If it has a frequency, it can be interrupted. We just need to introduce phase cancellation. Diana let out a choked, bitter laugh. Phase cancellation? Artie, this isn't a badly mixed drum track. They are directly microwaving our fear centers. The entire planet is experiencing a synchronized panic attack. Then we give the planet a Xanax, Ackley snapped. He turned to Chase. Kid, get up. Chase groaned, rolling onto his back. I can't. The sky is crushing me. The sky is fine. The ceiling in here is concrete, Ackley said brutally. Empathy wasn't his strong suit, and right now coddling wasn't going to save them. Get up and plug in. Fluorescent lights hummed a low, erratic rhythm above them as the station's backup generators kicked in. The psychic pressure hadn't wavered. If anything, it had deepened, settling into their bones like a damp, freezing winter. Ackley's hands shook as he patched cables into the main interface. He routed the signal through an ancient analog oscillator. If they are broadcasting a neurofrequency, Ackley muttered to himself, more to keep his brain from fracturing than to inform the others, we need to find its opposite, total destructive interference. He cranked the dial on the oscillator. A clean, piercing sine wave blasted through the massive studio monitors. Diana flinched, covering her ears. Turn that down! Does it help? Ackley shouted over the noise. No! Now I just have a migraine on top of the existential dread! Ackley killed the sound. He wiped a cold sheen of sweat from his forehead. The silence returned, and with it, the suffocating sensation of being trapped in a shrinking box. He grabbed his own shirt collar, pulling it away from his neck, trying to draw a full breath. The alien signal was too complex. It wasn't just a single note. It was a cluster of frequencies shifting in a microtonal sequence designed to evade simple jamming. Clean signals won't work, Ackley deduced. His cynical audio engineer brain was fully engaged now, treating the alien psychic terror like a competing sound tech who was ruining his mix. It's too perfect. White noise, pink noise, pure tones. It just slips right past them. We need something dense, something chaotic. Chase pulled himself up, resting his back against the base of a massive Mesa Boogie amplifier cabinet. His face was chalky, dark circles bruised beneath his eyes. Artie, it hurts, he mumbled. It feels like teeth grinding inside my brain. I know, Ackley said. He stared at the vast array of instruments lining the studio walls, synthesizers, acoustic guitars, a pristine grand piano. Then his eyes fell on Chase's guitar case. It was battered, covered in peeling stickers from 100 dive bar gigs. Inside lay a heavily modified, heavily scarred solid-body electric guitar, strung with thick gauge wires meant for tuning down to drop A. Chaotic, Ackley repeated. He looked at Chase. Plug the Gibson in, now. Diana frowned, rubbing her temples. Artie, you can't be serious. You're going to play music? The world is literally dying out there. The president is probably dead. Everything is vibration, Diana, Ackley barked, tossing a thick quarter-inch cable at Chase. It hit the young man in the chest, forcing him to catch it. Sound is vibration. Brainwaves are vibration. This psychic bullshit is just an electromagnetic vibration. We need to create a physical acoustic wave so dense, so harmonically complex, and so goddamn aggressive that it shatters the resonance of their transmission. Chase fumbled with the cable. His hands were shaking so badly he missed the output jack twice before slamming it home. He plugged the other end into a wall of amplifiers that Ackley had linked together, a daisy chain of raw analog power. "What do I play?" Chase asked, his voice cracking. "I can't even feel my fingers. I feel like I'm grieving my own funeral." "Don't think about it," Ackley commanded. He moved to the mixing board, his hands flying across the knobs, pushing the gain, cranking the low-end equalizer until the dials glowed red in the danger zone. "Give me distortion, maximum overdrive. I want the lowest, dirtiest, heaviest riff you have in your head. I want you to play like you're trying to break the strings." Chase stood up. He slung the heavy guitar over his shoulder. He closed his eyes, tears squeezing out from beneath his lashes as the psychic dread told him to drop the instrument and surrender to the void. He didn't. He hit a distortion pedal on the floor with the toe of his boot. A sharp electric hiss filled the room. It was the sound of restrained power, dirty and volatile. Ackley grabbed a specialized heavy-duty microphone used for capturing the thud of kick drums and jammed it directly against the grill of the largest amplifier. "Diana, your military node, can you patch my board's output into the base's public address system?" "The PA system? Yes, but—" "Do it," Ackley growled. "Route it through the emergency broadcast network. Everything you have clearance for, push it out." Diana hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She dragged herself to the auxiliary terminal in the corner of the studio, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. "Routing emergency override, tying into the Cheyenne Mountain array. It's live." Ackley looked at Chase. "Hit it." Chase brought his right hand down violently. The sound that erupted from the wall of amplifiers was not music. Not at first. It was a physical force. A massive, distorted, down-tuned chord slammed into the air. It was a guttural, mechanical roar that instantly vibrated the fillings in Ackley's teeth. The sound wave physically pushed the air in the room, hitting them in the chest like a closed fist. The concrete floor shuddered. Chase didn't stop. His fingers found a brutal, chugging rhythm. It was a slow, agonizingly heavy riff, palm muted and drenched in fuzz and overdrive. Chug, chug, squeal. It was dirty. It was imperfect. It was the sound of bending steel and grinding gears, a sonic representation of pure, unadulterated human defiance. And then, a miracle happened. As the heavy bass frequencies flooded the room, the psychic dread wavered. Ackley gasped, his eyes widening. He could suddenly draw a full breath. The terrifying pressure in his skull fractured like a pane of glass hit by a hammer. The alien broadcast relied on a pristine mathematical resonance to maintain its grip on the human mind. But heavy metal was an entirely different beast. It was built on dissonance. The sheer harmonic density of the distortion, the chaotic overtones, the aggressive low-frequency oscillation. It acted like a sonic battering ram. It didn't just mask the psychic wave, it violently disrupted it. The human brain, forced to process the overwhelming sensory input of the physical sound, was violently yanked out of the artificial dread loop. "It's breaking!" Diana shouted over the deafening roar of the guitars. She stood up straighter, the colour rushing back to her pale face. She stared at her terminal. "Artie, vitals on the upper floors are stabilising. People are waking up." Ackley bared his teeth in a savage, completely unheroic grin. His ears were ringing, his head was pounding, and the studio smelled strongly of burning dust from the overtaxed vacuum tubes in the amplifiers. It was beautiful. "Push the bass!" Ackley yelled, turning back to the console. He pushed the low-end sliders to the maximum limit. The meters weren't just in the red. They were pinned there, fighting for their lives. "They want to get into our heads. We'll vibrate their goddamn ships out of the sky. Chase found his groove. The panic in the kid's eyes had vanished, replaced by a fierce, adrenaline-fueled focus. He stomped on an octave pedal, dropping the pitch of his guitar even lower, plunging the room into a swamp of sonic sludge. The alien dread tried to creep back in, a cold whisper trying to slip through the cracks of the noise. But the music was too loud. It was too human. It was raw, sweating, imperfect, and violently alive. Ackley watched the monitors, feeling the kick of the rhythm in his sternum. The aliens had brought an invisible, silent weapon to conquer a world. They hadn't realized that humanity had spent the last 70 years perfecting the art of being incredibly, stubbornly loud. Vibrations tore through the studio's reinforced foundation, rattling the empty coffee mugs and shaking loose years of accumulated grime from the acoustic ceiling tiles. Ackley Chavez ignored the debris raining down onto his mixing console. His right hand remained clamped over the master fader, pushing it past the safe operating limits, while his left hand danced across the equalizer knobs. Sweat stung his eyes. The room temperature had spiked 10 degrees in the last 5 minutes. Analog equipment was not designed to run at maximum output on a continuous, uninterrupted loop. The massive tube amplifiers in the corner were glowing a violent, angry orange, radiating waves of dry heat that smelled distinctively of melting rubber and hot copper. Chase Holden stood with his legs planted wide, his back hunched like a cornered animal. He was not playing a song. He was executing a sonic assault. His heavy guitar pick violently scraped against the thickest wound strings, generating a relentless, palm-muted chugging rhythm. It was a filthy, sludgy riff, locked into a sluggish tempo that felt like heavy machinery dragging across concrete. Every time Chase struck the strings, the resulting shockwave punched Ackley right in the sternum. It was glorious. The alien dread, that sterile, paralyzing spike of mathematical terror, was still out there. Ackley could feel it pressing against the edges of his consciousness, like a freezing ocean trying to breach the hull of a submarine. But Chase's distorted guitar acted as a chaotic thermal layer. The immense density of the overdrive, packed with unpredictable subharmonics and aggressive distortion, shattered the pristine alien frequency before it could penetrate their frontal lobes. "Ackley!" Diana Stewart yelled, her voice barely cutting through the overwhelming wall of sound. She was leaning over her tactical terminal, her military jacket discarded on the floor, revealing a white undershirt soaked through with nervous perspiration. The base PA is saturated, but it's highly localized. We are creating a dead zone here, but the rest of the hemisphere is still paralyzed. Ackley grimaced, his jaw tightening. He reached up and rubbed his temples, feeling a dull ache forming behind his eyes. The sheer volume inside the room was punishing, but reducing it meant inviting the existential void back in. "We need a bigger amp," Ackley shouted back, his vocal cords scraping raw. "I don't have a bigger amp. We're underground," Diana fired back, frantically typing commands into her console. The green glow of the monitor cast harsh shadows across her cheekbones. She looked exhausted, her usual rigid military posture replaced by frantic survival instinct. "You have satellites." Ackley pointed a trembling finger at the thick bundle of fiber optic cables running from Diana's terminal into the wall. "You have access to the emergency alert system, the naval sonar arrays, the orbital comms network." Diana froze, her hands hovering over the keyboard. She stared at him, her eyes wide. "You want me to broadcast this noise across the entire global communication grid?" "It's not noise, it's phase disruption," Ackley grunted, sliding another fader up. He patched a secondary compressor into Chase's signal path, thickening the low-end frequencies until the floorboards audibly groaned. "They are using a global broadcast. We need a global counter-broadcast. Push the signal to every cell phone tower, every radio station, every digital billboard, every military outpost. If it has a speaker, I want it screaming." Diana hesitated. The protocol violations alone would warrant a court-martial, assuming any military court survived the day. She looked at Chase. The young man's fingers were moving mechanically, but his face was twisted in pain. Blisters were forming on his fingertips, and the calluses on his left hand were beginning to tear, smearing red drops of moisture across the polished fretboard. Yet, he kept playing, terrified that stopping would mean succumbing to the terror. Doing it, Diana muttered, her military discipline finally breaking under the sheer absurdity of the situation. She violently tapped a sequence of keys, bypassing the secondary firewalls of the Pentagon's auxiliary command node. I am linking your output feed into the primary NORAD transmission pipeline, bypassing civilian override. I'm routing it through the HARP array in Alaska to bounce the signal off the ionosphere. Give me 30 seconds, Ackley said. He turned his back to her and lunged toward a massive server rack housing terabytes of archived audio files. If they were going to broadcast to the entire world, a single guitar wasn't going to cut it. The aliens would adapt. Their ship's computers would analyze the frequency loop and find a way to filter it out. Ackley needed density. He needed pure, unadulterated auditory chaos. His hands flew across the digital directory, pulling up unmastered tracks from a Swedish death metal band he had recorded 5 years ago. He loaded isolated drum stems, double kick pedals firing at 240 beats per minute, blast beats striking snare drums with the force of rapid-fire artillery. "Chase!" Ackley roared over the din. "Keep the rhythm! I'm bringing in the cavalry!" Ackley unmuted the digital tracks. The studio exploded. The physical force of the double-kick drums hitting the subwoofers nearly knocked Diana out of her chair. It sounded like a barrage of machine gun fire echoing inside a steel cavern. The chaotic, relentless pounding locked in with Chase's sludgy, distorted guitar riff, creating an impenetrable wall of aggressive, suffocating sound. "Link is live!" Diana screamed, covering her ears with both hands. "Uploading to the global grid, now!" High above the atmosphere, 12 massive geometric structures hung in the silent vacuum of space. They were flawless, silent engines of conquest, projecting a synchronized neurolinguistic wave designed to switch off the survival instincts of an entire species. It was a clean, bloodless method of extermination. Break the mind and the bodies will simply stop fighting. Then, Earth screamed back. It didn't happen all at once. It started as a fractured ripple along the eastern seaboard of North America. Every cell phone in every pocket simultaneously buzzed, overriding volume controls, emitting a compressed, tinny burst of distorted guitar. Every abandoned car idling on the highway suddenly blasted blast beat drumming through shattered windows. Then, the massive naval arrays kicked in. Submarine communication transmitters blasted the dense, chaotic heavy metal frequencies into the ocean, vibrating millions of gallons of water. The HARP facility in Alaska fired a concentrated beam of radio frequency energy into the ionosphere, reflecting the brutal, dissonant chords across entire continents. Inside the subterranean studio, Ackley watched the digital readouts on Diana's terminal. The map of the world, previously glowing with the harsh red warning indicators of mass psychic casualties, began to flicker. "Look at the telemetry," Diana shouted, pointing at a separate screen tracking the orbital objects. Her voice was hoarse, her throat raw from trying to speak over the crushing volume of the room. Ackley squinted at the monitor. The 12 geometric ships, which had been holding a perfectly stationary orbit, were drifting. "They're losing synchronization," Diana said, a manic, disbelieving laugh escaping her lips. "Their broadcast relies on a unified neural network. Our signal is hitting their receivers. It's creating a feedback loop. The aliens had built their technology on the assumption of mathematical perfection. They communicated in pure sine waves, flawless logical structures, and serene digital harmony. They possessed absolutely no frame of reference for the sheer, irrational aggression of drop-tuned overdrive and aggressive polyrhythms. Ackley's studio monitors suddenly shrieked. A high-pitched, agonizing squeal sliced through the heavy metal tracks, causing Chase to stumble backward, dropping his hands from the guitar. "Don't stop," Ackley bellowed, slamming a hand down on the mixing desk. "They're trying to jam us. They're shifting frequencies." Chase hit the distortion pedal, max out the gain. Chase scrambled to his feet. His fingertips were raw, leaving smeared dark stains on the strings. He didn't care. The brief pause in the music had allowed a microscopic sliver of the alien terror to slip back into his mind, a cold, crawling sensation at the base of his skull. Panic fueled his movements. He stomped violently on the overdrive pedal, cranking the input gain until the pedal's internal circuitry protested with a violent hiss. He struck a dissonant, screeching power chord, sliding his hand up the neck of the guitar to create a sickening, pitch-bending wail. Ackley caught the signal and ran it through a digital delay effect, layering the screech upon itself until it formed a towering pillar of acoustic agony. He cranked the master volume past the red line, pushing the vintage amplifiers entirely into the theoretical danger zone. Smoke began to curl from the top vents of the Mesa Boogie cabinet. The heavy paper cones of the subwoofers were visibly warping, violently pushing air back and forth as they struggled to reproduce the apocalyptic noise. "Artie, the grid," Diana warned, backing away from her terminal. Sparks showered from the power conduit running along the ceiling. "We are overloading the local transformers." "Let them burn," Ackley yelled back. His eyes were wild, reflecting the flashing red lights of the clipping audio meters. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to achieve a perfect mix. He was trying to build a weapon. Give them everything. Up in orbit, the feedback loop reached critical mass. The alien's psychic projectors, designed to emit a specific, delicate neurofrequency, were abruptly force-fed a digitized, hyper-amplified barrage of Swedish death metal and tortured analog feedback. On Diana's screen, one of the massive orbital signatures suddenly flared bright white, then fractured into a dozen smaller, rapidly descending pieces. "Ship 4 just suffered catastrophic internal failure," Diana whispered, though Ackley couldn't hear her over the noise. She stared at the screen, her mouth hanging open. Their shielding collapsed. The feedback shattered their own navigation systems. Before Ackley could process the victory, the remaining 11 signatures abruptly altered trajectory. The red warnings tracking the psychic broadcast abruptly vanished from the global map. The pressure in the room vanished. The suffocating, invisible weight of absolute dread simply ceased to exist, disappearing as quickly as a flipped switch. Ackley immediately slammed his hand down on the master mute button. The sudden silence in the studio was deafening. It was heavier than the noise had been. The only sounds remaining were the ragged, gasping breaths of the three humans, and the violent, crackling sizzle of the overheated amplifiers melting down in the corner. Chase dropped his guitar. The heavy instrument hit the floor with a dull, unceremonious thud. He collapsed onto the stained carpet, staring at the ceiling, his chest heaving violently. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, his raw, damaged fingertips resting limp against his sides. Diana leaned over her console, her forehead resting against the cool metal of the monitor casing. She let out a long, shuddering breath. "They're gone," she rasped, her voice barely a croak. "Orbital velocity is increasing. They are breaking orbit. They're running away." Ackley stood perfectly still. His ears were ringing with a relentless, high-pitched tinnitus that he knew would likely never go away. The studio smelled of ozone, burnt plastic, and stale sweat. His beloved, incredibly expensive vintage tube amplifiers were completely destroyed, essentially reduced to slag. The mixing console was likely fried. He looked at Chase, lying exhausted on the floor, and then at Diana, who was trembling in her ruined military uniform. They had survived. Humanity had survived. Not through advanced weaponry or tactical brilliance, but because they were stubborn, messy, and perfectly capable of being the loudest, most obnoxious things in the galaxy. Ackley reached into his pocket, pulled out a crushed pack of cigarettes, and lit one with trembling fingers. He took a long drag, exhaling a thick plume of grey smoke into the stagnant air of the recording booth. "Well," Ackley muttered, his voice gravelly and cynical as he surveyed the smouldering wreckage of his life's work. "That's going to be a hell of a repair bill." The silence that followed was heavy, paid for in blown speakers and shattered nerves. We didn't win with lasers. We won by turning our pain into a weaponized wall of sound, proving humanity is too loud to be broken. If this raw, unapologetic slice of heavy metal survival hit a chord with you, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow defenders of Earth, and subscribe for more gritty sci-fi storytelling. Keep your amps loud.